Hi, I'm Zachary. So, I'm guessing many of you have a bookshelf made in China, or maybe jeans made in Sri Lanka, or maybe a sweater made in Turkey. And if you shop at American Apparel, I guess you might have a t-shirt, maybe like a cable knit ruched jumper made in California. And the US has required country of origin labels since 1930, and while they tell us some things about our products, like where they're made, there's a lot that's left out. And so they leave us with questions like, who made our products, and what were their working conditions, and when we paid for them, how was our money distributed? Before the Industrial Revolution, these answers came easily. Products were made by hand or in one's own local area, but with the onset of industrialization in the mid-19th century, division of labor and machine production created menial tasks and questionable working conditions, and traditional handiwork started to be replaced. So in around the 1880s, the arts and crafts movement sprung up in Britain as a reaction to these changes, and it soon spread to Europe and the US, and even as far out as Australia. This movement was led by William Morris, as pictured here with his big beard, and the craftsmen involved in this movement generally formed guilds to create high-quality handmade goods, and they championed enjoyable labor, and they denounced the evils of machine production. In their minds, a reformation in design was linked with a reformation of society, and naturally they desired to spread their handmade goods far and wide, and put them spread the practice of making things by hand all over Britain and Europe and the US. However, most historians agree that they failed. Their products were simply too expensive for a number of reasons and narrowly distributed. And ultimately, their movement against the industrial process just remained tied to the upper middle class and the rich. You can see an example of one of their very nice, but obviously expensive, and objects that suffered limited production. Of course, in the last 10 years, or in the last century, industrialization and machine production are more prevalent than ever. And in the last 10 years, crafters today have reacted much the same way as their arts and crafts predecessors. They champion the handmade just as fiercely as William Morris, and they say do it yourself, DIY, as they are the DIY craft movement. See, this is not a movement of professionals like their arts and crafts predecessors. The DIY craft movement is led by amateurs who seek to make craft above all accessible and secondary affordable. It is a more focused and accessible movement than the arts and crafts craftsmen that came before them, and is a more viable alternative to the industrial mainstream than ever. So the failures of the British arts and crafts movement comes down to two things: their philosophies and their work practices. They organized themselves in guilds as they were inspired by the Middle Ages and the widespread handicraft that was enjoyed in that time period. And they were mostly made up of upper middle class professional craftsmen, and mostly men, though some women were involved in the movement. On the fringes, I would say, unfortunately. Their most famous design reformer was William Morris, this bushy bearded guy. And together they created, he espoused many of the main tenets of the movement and inspired arts and crafts to spread throughout Europe and the US. The problem with Morris and the arts and craftsmen was they really looked down on trade, and in British society at the time, tradesmen and merchants were seen as lower class. So they were very resistant to opening multiple shops to sell their goods. So instead they sold goods through exhibitions, single locations, their studios, or they took commissions. But basically their attitude towards shops undermined their ability to spread crafts far and wide. And actually in 1914, the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, from which the movement was named, split in two when the younger craftsmen wanted to open up a shop and the older artistsmen opposed because it would be low class. Another issue is even if their crafts are widely distributed, they still would have been priced too highly. Many of the craftsmen relied on the handmade to make a living, so they had to inflate the price of their goods, and also most of them engage in expensive crafts like woodworking, loom weaving, and silverwork, whose materials did not come cheap, as beautiful as they were. They're also committed to quality, so they did not want to use low-quality materials or low-cost materials or cut corners. And there was one critic who kind of biting with the movement. He said it appeals only to the wealthy and leaves popular art without improvement or encouragement. And arts and crafts practitioners themselves recognize this shortcoming. C.R. Ashby, a major leader in the movement who was head of the Guild of Handicraft, once complained, "We have made of a great social movement a narrow and tiresome little aristocracy working with great skill for the very rich." The other issue was they were all, of course, staunchly against the machine. They were rallying against industrialization. The machine had the power to make their goods widespread and cheap, but that was the opposite of their movement, so there's no answer there. There were people at the time making large amounts of handmade goods for low prices. Unfortunately, they were sweat laborers, usually lower class members of society or low income members of society or immigrants who worked tirelessly to create just shoddy handmade goods and really lived in unfortunate situations. Their work was handicraft, but it was removed from like enjoyable labor or pride in one's work, and that was very central to the arts and crafts. So there's no solution in that either. So at this point, we have to ask ourselves, is this handmade revolution even possible? Like, can you make handmade goods cheaply and can you distribute them widely? And can you encourage people to take up the handmade to circumvent the problems inherent in the industrial process? Well, there was one critic in the 1890s who presented a new model for the success of the handmade. His name was Louis Mumford, and he wrote, quote, "To survive, handicraft would have to adapt itself to the amateur, and it was bound to call into existence, even in pure handwork, those forces of economy and simplicity which the machine was claiming for its own." Well, today, the do-it-yourself craft movement is doing just that. DIY crafters are amateurs who utilize inexpensive materials and efficient means of production to spread their crafts far and wide. Through the internet, a technology, of course, unfathomable to those in the arts and crafts, they're able to organize an efficient, far-reaching movement. And prominent leaders like Morris, working with expensive materials like silver, are gone. Instead, they've been replaced by 20-somethings, needlepointing, things like this. As I said before, the internet is the greatest tool of this young movement. There were indeed 19th century amateur crafters. There were arts and craftsmen who were amateurs, but they had trouble organizing because they didn't have a wide network like that, and they had difficulty selling their wares on a national level. Now, through websites like craftzine.com or ravelry.com or Etsy, crafters can swap tips and they can learn new techniques, and in the case of Etsy, they can sell their goods. It's no coincidence the DIY craft movement arose around the late 90s, just as the internet was beginning to boom in the US. So almost overnight, the internet solves the dilemma of the arts and crafts of distribution. It makes them available to people throughout the country rather easily. But the kinds of goods people are making is tackling another problem. They're keeping prices low. Because crafters mainly create products as secondary income, not primary income, they're able to keep lower prices, and they also choose inexpensive materials like wool or yarn when creating their goods. This becomes evident when you look at the popularity of different items on Etsy. The most popular item is jewelry. There's 2 million pieces of jewelry listed on Etsy.com, which is the biggest website for craft currently. The second biggest item is accessories. There's 560,000 items listed on Etsy, and if you look at something like furniture, which is really popular among the arts and crafts but expensive and labor intensive, there's just 15,000 items. It's one of the lowest on the site. Meanwhile, knitting and crocheting, as you can see here, but not there. Knitting and crocheting have become some of the most popular crafts of the movement. Also, they're very affordable. They're represented by the website ravelry.com, which offers knitting tutorials and things of that nature. And Ravelry currently has 1,300,000 members, which is triple what it had at this time last year. So quite astonishing. Crafters also use recycled materials like this cassette tape wallet to keep prices low. Let's see. For example, Emily Kircher was featured in the DIY documentary Handmade Nation, and she crochets rugs from recycled materials like bathrobes or old linens. And it's kind of funny because William Morris complained of ministering to the swinish luxuries of the rich back during the arts and crafts movement, but you could buy this rug for $40, so it's a lot more affordable. But the DIY movement does a lot more than make consumption of handicraft affordable. Let's see, they're also committed to showing that anyone can make things by hand. Back during the arts and crafts period, there were, of course, monthly classes and periodicals and things of that nature. But DIY crafters, again, utilized the internet to spread these ideas further and in new ways. So through Ravelry or craftzine.com, crafters can swap techniques, and they can, both sides keep blogs, they keep tutorials on making new crafts. Casey and I both learned things ourselves through those kind of tutorials. Etsy takes it a step further. They have video tutorials on their site. And another important thing to note about Etsy is they make selling crafts a lot more affordable. They charge just 2 cents per item listed, and they take only 3.5% of sales. So they make it incredibly accessible to just, experiment and start selling online. Another trend in the DIY craft movement to increase accessibility is websites that bring accessibility to real-world communities and actually get people together in actual space, just not beyond the internet. A popular one is stitchandbitch.com, where people can find kind of needlecraft-based meetups in their area. There are currently 13 in Chicago, and one used to be hosted by the Museum of Contemporary Art. Another website, the Church of Craft, just hosts informal monthly craft meetings. There's currently 11 chapters in the US, and the newest is in Chicago. Another trend which adds this idea of accessibility is Sue Daly, who founded the Renegade Craft Fair and owns Renegade Handmade in Chicago, in an interview discussed that a new trend among crafters is building kits, so that maybe if you can't afford someone's craft, you could just buy an instruction manual and make it yourself. And this focus on accessibility is really working in the movement's favor. The Renegade Craft Fair, which is, as many of you probably know, completely made up of craftsmen from all over the country, started in Chicago and is now spread to Brooklyn, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Austin, I think. And next year it's actually going to hit London for the first year, so it's going to continue to expand. There's also numerous craft fairs beyond the Renegade that have popped up in cities like Portland, Milwaukee, Baltimore, Tulsa, all over the country. The number of handmade goods is also increasing in the US. It's kind of striking to look at Etsy's sale numbers. February of 2010, Etsy sold $20 million worth of handmade goods, and just this past February of 2011, that number was up to 34 million, so that's a 14 million increase in 1 year. And almost every month, they break their sales records in handmade craft. So the co-founders of Etsy and the Church of Craft envision a world where we buy and make handmade instead of supporting harsh factory conditions. And they want to make our products personal again by reconnecting us with the people who make them. And I think these numbers prove that their ideas are really spreading. The artisans of the arts and crafts movement failed to do any of this because their products were simply too expensive and they were narrowly distributed. But today's alternative crafters are not going to will not fall prey to the pitfalls of the predecessors. By utilizing the internet to reach a wide audience and by creating low-cost goods, they create a more viable mainstream they create a more viable movement to the industrial mainstream than those dusty old arts and crafts predecessors of the 1890s. Thank you.